We have an audience with us today from Princess Sumaya University in Jordan. So welcome to our online audience. We hope that you'll submit questions as well. In order to kick off the event today, I'd like to introduce to you Ambassador Ziadeh. Ambassador Ziadeh is the U.S. ambassador to Qatar and has served in posts throughout the region. So to introduce you to the event today, Ambassador Ziadeh.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you here all today and to be a part of introducing this very, very distinguished panel. I'm also very pleased to be here at the U.S. Center because the United States feels very strongly about issues of climate change and particularly the role of women in affecting policy and contributing to development, sustainable development worldwide. So I would urge you to follow some of our thinking on this. We've been quite vocal about it and will continue to be so. It helps being a female ambassador in this part of the world. That's the first step. It also helps to have a U.S. Secretary of State who's also female and is a real supporter of women's issues. In fact, I would say a champion of women's issues. According to the United Nations, the threat of climate change, of course, is an issue that is not gender neutral. It affects women, and in fact, in some ways, one could say disproportionately it affects women because it creates, climate change can have an impact on drought, uncertain or inconsistent rainfall, deforestation, all of the things that affects women's daily lives as they have to have access to consistent and affordable energy and how it affects their roles in the homes and as productive members of their family. Secretary Clinton acknowledged very early on in her tenure at the Department of State that women are on the front line of this crisis and that they face the issue of sustainable development challenges in their daily lives. And as a result, they really are key components and key participants in finding the innovative solutions to some of the issues that affect their daily life. We feel that women's input is critical in terms of adaptation and mitigation technologies and programs so they can protect their families and help us face these global challenges. Several years ago, Secretary Clinton launched an initiative in this vein to tackle a particular issue that faced many women around the world, and one that is very much linked to the issue of energy poverty, and that is the absence of modern cooking technology in half of the world's homes. Fires are used for cooking, often inside the home, creating toxic air pollution and often killing individuals, women and children in the home. The Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves has been a partnership launched by the Secretary between the United States, foundations, private companies, and other governments worldwide to try and provide homes around the world with clean and affordable cook stoves by 2020. And of course, the United States is also very committed to having women have a seat at the table, and we have a panel with women all here today to talk about the decisions that are made on the environment, whether it's environmental policy to natural resource investment decisions at all kinds of levels, talking about negotiations here at the COP18. We have women participating on the local, on the national and international level, making sure that we are able to make women's voices heard as it affects women's everyday lives and our families. And of course, to ensure success, we in the United States, as other countries around the world, we make sure that we support women, women's entrepreneurship, women's education, making sure that women have the tools, whether it's in their intellectual ability or startup businesses, to be able to work effectively towards the issue of their own sustainable development and economic development. And part of that, of course, is making sure that sustainable development takes into consideration climate change and all the challenges that we face. So on that note, I'm delighted to say that we have a very distinguished panel today. I'm going to leave it to members of the panel to continue this discussion. I just wanted to set the framework in terms of our policy as the United States and, again, As the U.S. ambassador here, I'm delighted that you're here at the U.S. Center, and I thank our panelists in advance for what I know will be a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to introduce to you our moderator, but first let me just ask everyone that's standing in the back, can you please come in and get a seat? There's several seats just here and some over there as well, so please everyone come in and get a seat. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to introduce to you Ms. Lisa Jacobson, who is the president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and she will be moderating the panel today. Ms. Jacobson serves as a private sector observer to the World Bank's Climate Investment Fund and is a member of the Department of Energy's State Energy Efficiency Steering Committee. So she's here with us today to moderate this panel and to introduce our other panelists. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Ambassador. That was an excellent opening to what I hope, as you do, will be a very fruitful conversation among us. So I'm the president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. It's a U.S.-based trade association focused on promoting energy efficiency, renewable energy, and natural gas as solutions to climate mitigation and adaptation. The Council has been involved in the climate change process since the Earth Summit in 1992, and I've been privileged to serve as their Director of International Policy starting in 1997, and then have been President since 2005. So with many of the distinguished panelists here, have some experience in the process that I know we'll share. I'm very fortunate and privileged to be with this group of women really spanning the political, sustainability, energy, and environmental fields at the highest level, and very strong women to boot. So what we'd like to do today is to have a conversation on the critical issues confronting the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process from our distinct perspectives. We're having this conversation in the context of an elevated focus of the role of women in adaptation, mitigation, technology, and finance here at this session. And at the beginning of this session, a Gender Day was held that Mrs. Robinson and others might wish to share their reflections on. In addition, the parties are considering text at this meeting that would strengthen and promote the participation of women in our work. These are significant developments that make the time of our talk together especially meaningful. So I'd like to ask the panelists to each take a few minutes to make some opening comments, and then after that I will ask a few questions from the panel, and then we'll open it up to you and to those on the internet to ask some questions. So first, let me introduce our panelists. Our first speaker today is Mrs. Mary Robinson. She is the president of the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice. Mrs. Robinson was the first president of Ireland from 1990 to 1997 and the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002. She founded and served as president of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, and has dedicated her life as a human rights advocate. The recipient of numerous honors and awards throughout the world, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama, Mrs. Robinson is a member of the Elders, former chair of the Council of Women World Leaders, and a member of the Club of Madrid. So, Mrs. Robinson, let me turn to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here, and I thank the U.S. Center for organizing this meeting. I think we're going to have a really good discussion. I don't come to Doha as a climate scientist. I come because, as a human rights advocate over many years, as you said, I began to realize the way in which climate change was undermining very important human rights of very poor people. Rights to food and safe water and health and education and shelter, and displacing people, which can cause conflict. And so it became clear that this is a hugely significant and important human rights issue. But then I realized it's more than that. It's a save the world issue, because climate change is undermining the capacity of people to go on living in any kind of social cohesion in our world, unless here in Doha and beyond Doha we take much more urgent decisions. So I formed the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice to draw attention to the injustice of who is already affected by climate change. The poorest communities and poorest countries who are least responsible, and probably not responsible at all, for the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing global warming. And there are many, many things that we can do, including the one that we're going to talk about here, the access to energy for the very poorest. Before I say 2 words about that and what our foundation is doing, could I just say that this has been a good conference so far for gender, as you mentioned. I sat in a room the other day and watched negotiators from all the different countries, including the United States, but from all the participants from different parts of the world, with a common purpose: to adopt a decision with a goal of gender balance in all the bodies of the UNFCCC and in the delegations. The decision was adopted by the SBI. It still has to get formal approval by the COP, by the conference itself, but nobody seems to think there's a problem in that, I'm glad to say. Can't we learn a lesson from that? There was a shared goal, and negotiators negotiated with respect, but with common purpose. Why can't we have the same spirit in this wider conference? I don't see it. I see the delegates as if it was a trade negotiation, staying behind their set positions, not being open, not creating trust, not having a common urgent purpose to adopt a climate agreement by 2015. So that's the overall concern. Coming back just very briefly, finally, to the issue of access to energy for the poorest. When we formed the foundation, we interrogated ourselves. If we really were thinking about the poorest, who do we mean in this context? The UN has declared 2012 the year of sustainable development for all. Will it reach all the 1.3 or 4 billion who have no access to electricity and use kerosene or candles? The 2.6 billion, and I'm glad you mentioned the role the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has played with others in the Clean Cookstoves Alliance. I'm on the advisory committee of that alliance, and I very much think that it's a beginning, but it's probably going to reach about 100 million, and that's ambitious for it. What about the 2.6 billion? How are we going to reach them? How are we going to reach the very poor who desperately need to have access to energy, because they're also the people most affected by climate. So they're suffering from more food insecurity and more water shortage, and then they have to go further, spend more time, and they don't have the energy gadgets that are now becoming available. So briefly, what we have done is we have brought together those who work in countries in social protection systems, from Mexico, from Brazil, from part of India. There's a very good, very interesting one in Ethiopia, the social safety nets, social productive safety net system that reaches about 8 million people. And what happens is generally for being productive or in different ways, part of what people get is maybe a goat or chickens, but not energy. And in most of the social protection systems, energy has not been prioritized. So it is a very interesting challenge to us, because what we want is models that will work in providing energy through the social protection systems, and then we will scale up to millions and get towards the 1.3 billion for light and the 2.6 billion for clean cook stoves. And I think this is an issue of great interest to women, business women, women everywhere, and I hope we can make a dent in it, a real dent in it, in the near future. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kit Batten. She was appointed as the United States Agency for International Development's Global Climate Change Coordinator in January 2011. In this capacity, Dr. Batten serves to coordinate climate change activities across the agency. Prior to her appointment at USAID, Dr. Batten was Senior Science and Policy Fellow and Program Director at the Heinz Center's Institute for Science, Communication, and Policy Development.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about women and climate change from a development perspective. And really, today, I'm here to talk about making development as strong and successful as possible. And so what does that mean in terms of including women and working with women? It's about the knowledge that women have. It's about the leadership skills that women have. And it's about the vulnerabilities that some women experience, as Mary was just mentioning. So my perspective here is trying to figure out, and as all of USAID is doing right now, the best ways to integrate both men and women in everything that we're doing so that we're as successful as possible. Over the past 2 years, USAID has actually increased our engagement on gender. We've come up with new definitions of gender issues. We've hired new senior leadership positions focused on gender equality and female empowerment. And we have a new major policy entitled Gender Equality and Female Empowerment. So all of this is about empowering women and girls to participate in and also benefit from development. So how do we do this? We actually have a requirement to consider gender and to do a gender analysis for all the programming that we do, all the development programming that we do. And that makes sure that we're reaching 100% of the population we're trying to serve rather than only 50% or some other lower percentage than 100. So through climate change in particular, we just came out with our climate change and development strategy in January of this year. And specifically in that strategy, we call out the need to be doing such gender analyses and to engage women across the work that we're doing on mitigation, adaptation, and also integrating opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change across everything that we do, whether it's in health programming or in food security programming, disaster risk reduction, et cetera. So in terms of, I want to do a few examples in terms of the work that we're doing right now, and then we'll be able to get into some more detail during the question and answer session. So why are women so important in terms of, I mentioned knowledge, leadership, and vulnerability? Why are they so important in terms of their knowledge and contributing to the work that we're doing in climate change and development? Well, women have a unique knowledge of their local environments and frequently are very tied to natural resource management in the developing world. And as such, they understand this direct link. They're seeing the changes that climate change is already having, and they're motivated to act and lead and get the rest of their communities involved in making changes to help combat the effects of climate change. So that includes all of their work of, all of their traditional knowledge in terms of flora and fauna. It includes the strong social networks that they already have, mobilizing all of that expertise. One example that we have in working in Micronesia, after a long period of drought, we worked with women to figure out where to drill new wells because they knew from their historical knowledge where water used to be. And so just one example there. Also, we need to be involving women in decision making and planning, and that's what we're doing. When women are involved in decision making, they're going to, of course, be more willing to lead and adopt new practices if they understand them. So one way that we're doing that, we have a new flagship program called LEAF, which stands for Lowering Emissions in Asia's Forests, and it's a REDD+ project that we're doing regionally in Southeast Asia. And it's all about increasing women's capacity to engage in and lead REDD+ activities. And so I mentioned the gender analyses that we do. We're making sure that on all 4 of these points, women are leading. So leading in regional knowledge sharing, outreach, and dissemination of information, policy advocacy, leadership skills training, and increased capacity of organizations. So across all of these activities, we're ensuring that we're engaging women. We have another example within the clean energy arena. So in Bangladesh, we worked on training women on how to be installing home photovoltaic systems and also cleaner cook stoves. And so what that led to is a recognition of how much money could be saved from these systems in these households, how much less air pollution there was as a result, and it was very marketable. So now we have a demand for these systems, and jobs were created for these photovoltaic, I can't say that fast enough, photovoltaic systems, and created new jobs for everybody, but that included women as well. And then one last example that I'd like to talk about. So when you talk about, when you don't include women in your programming, you miss things. So women make up an average of 43% of farmers in developing countries because they have less access to land, training, information, and credit, they tend to have 20 to 30% less yield on their land than men do. And so if we're able to engage them, make sure that we understand those barriers to land, knowledge, training, and credit, and solve those barriers, then we can actually increase food security for the entire country, world, et cetera. I was at an event earlier today with a colleague who mentioned that it's so important to talk with women about the types of information that they need. If you're talking about food security, you might think, okay, what's really important? When the rains begin? What is the projected beginning of the rainy season? Turns out in Senegal, just as important is when the end of the rainy season is projected to be, because men plant their fields first at the beginning of the rainy season, and if the rainy season is shortened too much, then the women don't get to plant their fields. And so if you don't have that information which spans the entire rainy season, women are disproportionately affected. I know I've been talking probably for too long, so I will maybe just say, to reiterate what Mary has said, women are, for a number of reasons, more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so in our planning with respect to reducing vulnerability and empowering women through our climate change and other programming, we're also paying attention to that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Batten. Next is Jennifer Morgan. She is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the World Resources Institute. She oversees the Institute's work on climate change issues and guides WRI's strategy in helping countries, governments, and individuals take positive action toward achieving a zero-carbon future. Jennifer.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation and to be here with all of you gals. WRI, I'm here, Mary was saying why she's here, I'm here to try and accelerate the pace of change, right? Because it's not happening fast enough, and we know that the impacts, if any of you saw the recent World Bank report that looked at what a 4 degrees world looks like, then you know that the difference between a 2 degrees world and a 4 degrees world is immense, and it kind of just flips off the tongue as if it's no big deal, but actually it's a fundamental change in the way our planet works. And so that's kind of why I'm here. I think that one part of that is voice and participation. WRI has done a lot of work over the years in our governance program on trying to open up decision-making processes around the world, whether they be in the forestry field, whether they be in the electricity planning phase in various countries, whether it be assessing those processes and what international financial institutions are doing, and certainly gender and participation of women and voice to women in that always plays a role. But the other piece that I kind of wanted to bring up here, which I don't have any great experience on, but it's just kind of my gut, is about women as innovators. Women, the household role and the resource manager is very powerful. But what about the women who are managing large energy projects around the world? What about the women who are the engineers and the managers in that industry? How do we pull those and support those women as well? Which is, as you know, if you've sat in the boardrooms around the world, you know that it can be a lonely place. Lisa, you may have more experience of that than I do, but and so the question I kind of ask is how we pull those stories out as well, which is a different part of this story, I think. Because when I think of women and my experience, and I've been to every single one of these COPs, is if I had done a WRI analysis of an indicator of who has spoken most truth to power over 18 years of climate negotiations, I think I could come up with something that had more women than men in that context, just to be a bit provocative maybe. And I think that how to give that voice as organizers, as networkers, as kind of power brokers is a question of empowerment for me as well. I think we've had in this process, a really interesting time of having so many women presidents over the last years, and now having an executive secretary as well. And I think it could be interesting to reflect, okay, well, what does that make a difference? I actually long ago looked at the role of women in decision making, and is there a difference, whether it's a woman or a man? And of course, that's an incredibly difficult thing to try and suss out. But I am convinced that the skills that women bring to these negotiations and to these problems, which are immensely complex, require very good listening skills, are just inherent to finding the solutions. So it's not a surprise to me that you have successful Secretary of States from the U.S. that have been women, that we have successful presidents been women. So just to throw that into the mix as well.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the moderated discussion. Our next panelist is Amy Barnes. Ms. Barnes currently advises the United Arab Emirates Directorate of Energy and Climate Change in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on international climate change policy and negotiations. She's advised this ministry under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Clean Energy Ministerial, the G20 process, and Rio Plus 20. Amy.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me. And thank you also to the women on the panel for sharing this panel with me. It's an honor to be up here. I thought I might just share a little bit of my perspective as an American woman working actually for another government, for the United Arab Emirates government, as a part of these negotiations, and maybe just share a little bit about what the UAE is doing on women's empowerment in the region, and actually, interestingly, also in cooperation with the US government. So I came to work in the region in the United Arab Emirates 2 years ago. As Lisa said, I work in a directorate that focuses on energy and climate change. And one of the really exciting things about working in this region, and in the UAE in particular to me, is the ambition that there is here to really make a meaningful contribution to address the impacts of climate change. So the work that I've done here over the past 2 years in that respect has been really interesting. But the UAE has been a really interesting place to be, not only because of the ambition that they have when it comes to addressing climate change, but also the interest that they've shown in empowering women in the context of energy and climate change. And there are a number of initiatives that are going on in that respect in the country. The first one that I thought I would highlight, just because it is relevant to the US, is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. And it's called the C3E Initiative, Clean Energy Education and Empowerment Women's Initiative. So this is an initiative that's a partnership of the UAE, the US, and a number of other countries to try and think about how you get young women interested in science, technology, engineering, and maths careers, and then how you really bring them up from that educational background into careers that have to do with energy, climate, and sustainability, and then through to leadership roles in those careers. I can say from my own personal experience working on this initiative over the past 2 years, this has been an incredibly rewarding piece of work, getting to see some of the women that I work with, getting really engaged and interested in working on energy and working on climate change. But beyond that, the UAE has also invested a lot, as I said, in sort of the first bit, in education, in sort of science, technology, engineering, and maths backgrounds for women. And I think that's sort of one of the places where we're starting to see great dividends in the country already. So for example, the UAE has something called the Masdar Institute, which is a joint venture between MIT and Masdar, the Masdar Initiative. In Masdar Institute, in the first year, a really interesting statistic, 100% of the Emirati women in the first class, 100% of the Emirati population of the first class of Masdar Institute were women. And so you see in the country a really impressive pool of young, talented women who are really interested in working on these kinds of things. And so that gives me, a lot of hope, and it's a very sort of inspiring thing to see and to be able to work on. I guess going beyond that, I would say that the commitment to women and empowering women in climate and energy is something that has been not only a domestic activity through some of the work of Masdar Institute and C3E, but also something that's been brought to the international stage. In Rio Plus 20, we had women's empowerment as one of the core tenets of the negotiations platform there, and this has been a high priority for the UAE government here in COP18. As Mary mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work together with the U.S. negotiators and negotiators from all countries countries on advancing this gender text, which has been a really positive process, a really inspiring process. As Mary said, I think a great example of what can be done when people actually get together and work in the right direction towards something that we all believe in. So yeah, I guess I would just stop there. I think very much looking forward to hearing questions from the audience and having a conversation with the panelists, not only about sort of our role as women in all of these processes, but also just sort of the broader issues at hand overall, what we think is going on in the negotiations, how the gender text is coming forward, you know, the work that all of us are doing. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Amy. I think we have time for just a couple of questions among us. And I think I'm going to, dive right into what you suggested and maybe talk a little bit about the energy access issue, because it was covered by our first two speakers. We're here in the negotiations where they're working on some operational aspects of the climate change regime, the technology mechanism, and the finance arena. And when you look out, either from the development perspective or from the seats that either Jennifer or Amy you sit in, do you see the issue of energy access being addressed in those types of conversations? Or are they better suited at different levels of government interaction? How can it be enhanced, and we be sure that as we're setting up these new institutions that they're addressing the important issue of energy access? You get your choice.
It's come back.
Okay.
I think that's a good question. What I find, because our foundation being focused on climate justice is really very focused on the poorest, and it's hard to get their viewpoint across, very hard. And energy itself is not a world that until recently women have been comfortable in. I'm glad to say that's changing. As Amy said, it's changing in this region, it's changing everywhere. But there's a tendency to think of energy as being gender neutral. It's not. Women and men, especially at grassroots, actually look at energy quite differently. Men are into cash crops and productivity. Women are thinking about light for education and health in the clinic, light in the clinic for health. And there are differences, as we found in a study of Malawi, of how women and men approach the issues. I think it's really going to be very important that we have this text, which I hope the COP will endorse, about gender parity in all of the bodies of the UNFCCC. It's not there yet. Women have, on the whole, about 10%, including the technical committee. The Green Climate Fund, which is talking about gender, still only has about 8 women out of much larger, about 40 members. So we have a long way to go. Why is it important? I agree with Jennifer that women are very innovative, but there are 2 other things. We also tend to be much more intergenerational. Just because we have that nurturing role, we think about our children, and in my case, my beloved grandchildren. I'm always talking about them like a real Irish grandmother, And women are also very practical. We actually think of the specific impacts of changing climate that's affecting very poor people because they no longer have seasons, for example, in a lot of places. It's just periods of drought and then flash flooding. And it's undermined their capacity to know when to sow. They're having to adapt in a very innovative way and having to really think about how to secure food and water, etc. And so if we have a gender balance on all the bodies of the UNFCCC over the coming years, I think we will see more urgency and more practical concern about how it's impacting on particularly women in poor countries and poor communities. But at the moment, I don't think the COP does actually affect that part of the decision.
So I'll just talk about energy access more from a development perspective and more from what USAID is currently engaged in. I think that just like any limited resource in certain areas, if there's very limited access to reliable energy or no access, that can be a power dynamic that's exhibited, and sometimes women have less access as a result, right? So working on providing energy access for all in this year of sustainable energy access for all, we launched an initiative earlier this year in June, which is called Powering Agriculture. And it's all about making sure that there is energy access and clean energy access for food security. So in areas that are currently only served by very variable diesel generators or no electricity, being able to go into these areas with new technologies that provide clean energy but are grounded in food security uses. So for post-harvest processing, for irrigating, for storing food, for being able to turn milk into cheese, for example. All of these things, being able to have your crops around for a longer period of time, get them to market, et cetera, make you far more food secure. And as with any of our work, as I described earlier, a gender analysis is a critical component to being able to get the funding for this work. And we launched this initiative in partnership with Duke Energy, which is a U.S. energy company, with some of our fellow U.S. agencies, the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, but then also with the African Development Bank, and our main founding partner at the beginning is the government of Sweden as well. So we're looking for additional partners. The request for proposals for this initiative will be released in this month, December, so keep an eye out for that. But yes, absolutely, access to clean energy is something that's critical for development.
Maybe just a quick reflection. I mean, I don't think that the issue of energy access gets the attention that it needs, I think, at these negotiations at least. And I think that it underestimates the importance of that question in the formulation of different countries' positions. So if you're a major emerging economy, but yet you still have however many tens or hundreds of millions of people who don't have any energy access, it's going to have a big impact on whether or not you're willing to step forward and, quote, take on further commitments. And yet, I think oftentimes the technology discussions focus on the larger, the big stuff, and don't really address that head on. I think the initiatives that are occurring in this area are just really fundamental. And I think until governments have the sense that they can provide those energy services to people at price parity or below, then it's very difficult to see how the dynamics here will change. So I think that looking at how the Green Climate Fund emerges, looking at the access issues, I think will be quite important moving forward.
Yeah, maybe I can just speak quickly with from some perspective from one of my former positions, which was actually working on CDM project development. And I think that's actually a really good example of how sometimes when you get into the technical details, you don't create spaces for things like energy access. For example, in the Clean Development Mechanism, methodologically, it was very difficult to start doing energy access projects because people just hadn't really thought about how you tackle that from a technical perspective. And so I think Jennifer is very right. As you start getting into conversations about the Green Climate Fund and the tech, et cetera, it will be really important to think about not only sort of from a big picture perspective, how do we bring the access question in, but also from a technical, from a more detailed perspective, how do you kind of create the actual mechanisms to get at those projects because they are so important.
Right, and I can just echo that, from the work that we're doing right here in this meeting, the focus is getting the message out of the scale of the financial resources that will need to be brought to bear to address climate change mitigation and adaptation. So on one hand, we're really trying to, from the business community, trying to elevate that and make it clear really what's required and what the role of the business community can and should be, and then what instruments are required to get that done. But on the other hand, in the focus on scale and the very, very large, as you were saying, Jennifer, that other agenda really does not have a home, and maybe that's something that we could work on together and thinking about how that can be done in an effective way through the new mechanisms that we're putting forward. So that might be, I have one last question before we open it up to all of you. Something that you had said, Mary, about why does it matter that proportionally we have more women participation. I wanted to talk a little bit about that, both from your experience more broadly professionally and the UN process. What's your perspective on the evolving role of women here and in the other initiatives or, business and activities you're involved in?
Well, briefly, because I know we do want to get to the audience, I learned a lesson when I was first elected to the Irish Parliament at the age of 25. I came back from Harvard full of what my husband called Harvard Law School humility, and I stood for the Irish Parliament at an earlier age than usual. Anyway, but I learned that initially there were 6 of us out of the Senate of 60 members, and we had little impact. When we went to 13, it suddenly changed. We were critical mass. And I'm a huge believer now in critical mass in bodies. Not 1 woman or 3 women, but actually critical mass. And it was actually a critical mass of women leaders who helped to get this text to this conference. Because of the 3 women who had been presidents of the Conference of the Parties, the COPs, we were able to get them to form a troika. And then we formed a troika plus of about 60 ministers of energy, environment, including a number of supportive men, as there are, I'm glad to say, supportive men in the audience here. And we worked with the leadership of the conferences, with member states, etc., to say, how can we get a text forward? The EU was willing to put it forward, Finland having put it through the EU, other countries were willing to support, and that's how we kind of got it onto the agenda, and then had the parties really take it on in a very serious way, to purpose. Now, what does that mean? It means that we will have the critical mass. Gender parity actually means gender balance means 50-50. We won't get that tomorrow, but we will get more balance, and that will have an impact. As I said, women are more intergenerational. We need intergenerational decisions. I'm afraid that, again, from my political experience, politicians don't have an intergenerational horizon most of the time. They have 6 months or the next election, and we actually have to somehow inject more intergenerational justice. I keep thinking, you know, my 4 grandchildren are going to be 40, in their 40s in 2050. They will share the world with 9 billion others. It will be a food-stressed world, a water-stressed world, a very difficult world. And what will they say about us? You know, what will they say? And I think we need more thinking like that, thinking intergenerationally, that we have the time and the possibility to take decisions, which if we don't take them, they won't be able to take. It'll be gone too far. The tipping points will be gone. We'll be into a 4 degrees or worse. And we saw what the World Bank said about that. So it's, I think that and women have that kind of empathy with the impact it's going to have on poor women. We have a solidarity with our sisters, which would affect the climate discussions, you know. So I think critical mass is extraordinarily important in trying to get better decisions and more thoughtful decisions, and decisions that will fill the gaps that we're talking about.
Thank you. Maybe very quickly, see if anyone else has any comments.
Well, you'd asked about our own personal experience here at the COPs over time, and my very first COP was in Bali. And I'm happy to say that, well, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, having a network of female mentors has been very important to me over the course of my career. And there are actually 2 women here in the room right now who were very important to me in that first COP, one of them sitting right next to me. And one of them is sitting back there. She's a negotiator for the U.S. government, Shira. And I remember I had no idea what was going on. I was working for an NGO at the time. I was lost. I didn't know which meetings I should be going to. I had no idea what was happening inside the negotiations. I found out about the white papers. Oh, okay, great, I can read those. That's how I'll figure out what's going on. But having worked with Jennifer, Shira, others over the years, and being able to use each other as a network of resources, information, and shared expertise has been extraordinarily valuable to me and has gotten to me to where I am now. So,
Great.
Thank you.
Well, let's open it up, shall we, Ashley, to the floor?
Okay, so we do actually have a question from the web, but we'll start with 2 from the floor. I'd like to suggest that we take 2 at a time and panelists answer. Okay, so if you just raise your hand, I'll come to you. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Teresa Turner from the International Oil Working Group in Canada and Friends of the Earth Canada. I've been working for some time with women in many countries, including in Canada, on keeping fossil fuels and uranium in the ground. For example, in Nigeria, women have been very, very active and effective in the Niger Delta with the support of their male allies in keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And I'm very thrilled to be in the same presence as Mary Robinson. And I would be very interested in what you think about the strategy of addressing ecocide, avoiding ecocide by keeping fossil fuels in the ground and thereby supporting the people that are trying directly to do that.
Okay, and we'll take one more. There was a hand over here. Ah. Excuse me.
Thank you. I'm Maria Neira from the World Health Organization, and I would like to add yet another argument for reinforcing the importance of clean energy, access to clean energy. When I was a young physician many years ago, well, a few years ago, they sent me to Africa, and I thought that I would be able to practice the medicine that I learned. And of course, one of the first things that I was requested to do was to take care of the women that were delivering. And then what's happened is that not only the facilities, that those healthcare facilities were almost non-existent, but the most dramatic one I found at that time is that the women were delivering without access to any type of electricity or energy. And I think one of the most critical moments in the life of a woman when you are delivering and having a candle trying to illuminate the whole thing, that was obviously one of the most dramatic things. I remember Mr. Ban Ki-moon saying that he remembered very, very well when he was a student. He was many times doing his studies with a candle, and he thought that this was absolutely dramatic, but I think it's even worse when you are delivering and you don't have the minimum access to electricity. That's a question of linking as well to gender, to human rights, and access to health, and that will generate a very powerful woman movement and definitely a motivation for doing more of this. Thank you.
Well, we want to try to get a little bit of time to get the question from the web, so let's see if anyone wants to take an attempt at either one of those. Thank you.
I'll take the first one since I was kind of named in it. It is actually a very interesting issue about the fact that more and more fossil fuels have been found, more and more oil, more and more coal, the fracking that's going on, the Arctic, etc. And I'm learning that there are a number of people who are talking very seriously at the moment about stranded assets, that when we have realized just how little time we have and how little fossil fuel we can continue, carbon, the greenhouse gases that we can continue to put into the atmosphere and stay anywhere safe in our world, they will become a little bit like asbestos, and not be actually. Now, at the moment, that raises huge issues of equity because there are countries that aren't at a stage of development where they feel they have any choice except to use what they can for development. So unless we put huge concentration on clean energies, then the temptation and the need to move to still use fossil fuel energy is going to be there. I'm sympathetic to what you're doing. I know that I think it's Uruguay has foregone the possibility of developing in order to preserve its rainforest, Ecuador, sorry, to preserve its rainforests, etc. And I'm very sympathetic. I think it's long-sighted, but it's also not very realistic in some circumstances, and I'm not the expert on the panel who can talk to that. But I do think we should think about the idea, instead of rushing to the Arctic and destroying the beauty of it and the precious role that it plays in our world, to think about the fact, do we really need to go there? Because actually, by the time the drilling comes on store, these will be stranded assets. We will not be able to use them because the world will be so unsafe at that stage. We will know the danger we've put ourselves into. That's what I feel.
I just think we need everything that we can get. I find the leaving the fossil fuel in the ground actually quite compelling from a public perspective, because I think what we're trying to do is very difficult to understand. And somehow I think, if you've seen Bill McKibben and other folks' graphs, which shows, okay, how much can you pull out of the ground and still stay below 2 degrees? And how many reserves are there, then it becomes it's another way of showing kind of what is needed. We've thought, we have the greenhouse gas protocol, we've thought, well, should we try and quantify this, because we quantify everything so that we can bring transparency to it. So I just say, I would encourage you to keep going.
Yeah. So I'd like to respond to your very good point about access to energy and health. at USAID, we're working on lots of different ways to make sure that we're integrating opportunities for clean energy with global health, but also looking at how epidemiology is changing, how disease vectors are changing, how as we are cutting down forests, that there's greater, there's more interface between diseases and humans in ways that haven't existed before. So looking at all these various ways in which that climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, interact with the health sector, I think are extremely important. And thank you for sharing that experience that you had. We, as I keep saying, we're integrating gender as well as climate change across all of that work.
Okay, let's get to our question from the web, and this comes from our audience in Amman, Jordan. This is in response to Kit's earlier comment about mentorship. Do you support women, or how do you support women in younger stages to help guide them toward green jobs?
I think that's a great question, and again, just building off some of the work that we've been doing on this in the UAE, I think education is obviously fundamental, and starting from a young age, from sort of elementary school level, creating opportunities for women and for girls to have tangible opportunities, understanding what opportunities there are for careers in those kinds of fields for them as they grow up, and getting them interested in the sort of foundational parts of education that will help them get onto those kinds of career paths. One example that we have in Abu Dhabi that I think is really great is a program that's run by the Environment Agency in Abu Dhabi, where they basically go into schools and each classroom can set up a specific program of how they want to make their own classroom more sustainable. I think it's just one of things like that that kind of help people have a tangible sense at a young age of the application of these kinds of things as they get older is really important. But I also think, as you were saying, mentoring is really important. And I think, having role models for women and girls, starting from very young, but then leading up through their sort of educational and career paths. Again, going back to the C3E initiative, I know that the United States has started an ambassadors program where they have leading women that have been working on energy, climate, and sustainability, who have sort of been tasked with being ambassadors for the issue and building awareness amongst younger women and girls about the opportunities in science, technology, engineering, and maths, and getting them really interested in those fields. So I think those are a couple of different ways that it can be approached.
If I may, just for a moment, to add to what Amy was saying, I think it's almost like the critical mass point I was making before. When we formed and helped to form with others the Troika Plus of women leaders on gender and climate change, we didn't want this to be a top-down of ministers on their own. We wanted those ministers to commit to listening to women at grassroots. So we have a kind of two-way dialogue going on, precisely for that kind of reason, that those who are giving leadership in their communities, who know so much, there are many of them who've come to this conference, and they are almost frustrated that they're not listened to. And I think women do have a capacity to listen, and to even listen collectively to the voices of women, and that's extraordinarily important and very affirming and very supportive and encouraging, and I think we need to just do more of that.
Okay, shall we go to a couple more questions from the audience? Okay, one here, and then if someone else has one, okay, we'll go here first.
Introduce yourself, please. Okay, thank you. I'm Rosemary from Uganda, and I represent a very big constituency of women. And since these discussions, women have been at the center of everything: clean energy, food security, access to energy stoves. And coming here at the COP, I expected action points that when I go back home, what is it that I can implement as a woman? Because we are here, we have high expectations, especially at the high level where we want to know whether we are going to achieve that green fund. When is it going to be effected? In the event that we still have a long period. What can we do as women in order to mitigate, to adapt to the kind of energy, the climatic change that we are talking about? And how do we strategize as women so that we move with action points that, yes, when we go back home, this is the trend that we are going to take, because we are concerned about our children, our lives. When we talk of these health, the diseases, mention it, it is at the center of women. What can we do as women so that we become proactive and we go beyond the rhetoric? Thank you.
Majd from Jordan. I just want to tell you that I do believe in leadership and education and advocacy roles in this main issue, and maybe that will lead us to have more climate-wise women, if I called it. And I just want to ask if there are any maybe campaigns or initiatives we can participate in to support this great issue. And as maybe public and women, for me, I do like to share maybe some experience or other maybe simple activities in my home in Jordan, and to have maybe contacts to raise this issue back to my home. Thank you very much.
Well, just one quick comment on, I think, both of your points. I mean, a lot of the negotiations are very high level and they're very process oriented. But one of the things that I thought was quite unique was the Momentum for Change initiative that the Secretariat put forward. It's one of Christiana Figueres's own concepts, and she launched it last year in Durban. And it showcases real action and projects. And maybe one thing to think about, piggybacking on the conversation we were having earlier about building into the new institutions this type of agenda and these programs, is to think about side initiatives that we could elevate, or networks that we can elevate that are more practical, that can sit comfortably in these sessions or intersessionally when the negotiations are going on. So that's just one comment I have.
Yes, I would actually agree with that. This is the first COP where there has been a full gender day with lots of events, and I hope you had a chance to participate in a few of those. But I sense and share your sense of kind of urgency and frustration. And actually something you said interested me, because you wanted to be given more opportunities to know what could be done, not just in adapting, but in mitigating. And I think we overlooked the fact that women leaders like you at local level in Uganda and what you're doing are doing both. It's quite remarkable, and are using technology as best possible. And that's part of, I think, something that certainly gives me hope, that if women can have access to support and funding for what they're doing, they are doing so much in their communities already. And it's a question of, it's almost a question of being shamed by what poor communities are doing, because they're faced with the reality. You have long periods of drought now in Uganda, and flash flooding, and that's a huge problem of trying to have food. So you have to. Where's the have to that we need in this conference for the negotiators? I think, you know, somehow we need to connect those who are in the coalface of needing urgent actions because the reality is there, and those who are negotiating process in this conference, as Jennifer knows better than I do.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the most important things, I see this happening in the U.S. as well, is that the local impacts that are being felt and the communities that are trying to deal with those, that there's a dot that's connected to the national politicians. Because right now I can tell you, after Hurricane Sandy, you know, you look at New Jersey, you look at parts of New York. Now, are those senators and governors climate champions yet? No, they're not. One is, two are. Cuomo is, Governor Cuomo, Mayor Bloomberg, right? But how, and this is, you know, in each country it's different, obviously, but we need the voices for change locally, but then we need to connect the impacts that are happening locally with the policymakers and the politicians that then nationally and then finally internationally can actually take that action. And there is all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill said. And so the fact that these impacts, you know, if you look at particularly at sea level rise and other drought impacts and the attribution that is is getting easier to look at what's climate related, what's not climate related. I just think that I encourage, as far as what to do, I think our biggest barrier are the politics and the power politics that go on. So how you break it, I think, is you do what Mary said. You take your story and you go knock on that door, and we figure out how to connect you all together so that you feel empowered by all the others who are doing it, whether they're in New Jersey or whether they're in Uganda.
I just wanted to respond to the comment here, and I like the term climate-wise women, so I think we have to take that forward. I think sort of in terms of how you build a network out and how you kind of take things forward, I think a lot of times these conferences get critiqued because what happens is the progress seems so slow and what is happening seems so opaque. But I think actually one of the most useful things that happens at these conferences is that people get together from all over the world. And I think in particular, this being the first time that we're having the COP in the GCC region, we've seen the Arab youth movement, I think, really come alive. And that's been a really inspiring thing, I think, for us. And so I think, to the extent that you can keep that alive and build out that network and strengthen it by reaching out to other people, other activists and other members of government and civil society that are here, I think that's a powerful thing to take forward.
Okay, so we'll take one more question from the audience, and we actually had one from the web, so I'll start with the web, and then we'll head out to the audience for one question toward the back, because I haven't gone to the back yet. And this is pushing us toward results. So this question from the web, climate justice, how far has this initiative come? How has it achieved its goals? And then I'll grab one from the audience. Here in the back, I saw one back here.
Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Queen Ehirim. I'm from Nigeria. I represent Action Fighters, and also I'm under the Women and Gender Working Group for Younger, which is official UNFF youth. And my question is very simple. I want to ask if you have a way of getting the knowledge of climate change and clean energy to the very grassroots through kind of formal education, because climate change is really has a great vulnerability to the grassroots. So I want to ask if you have maybe a kind of formal education advocacy that you can get the knowledge of climate change and clean energy to the grassroots. Thank you.
Okay. Was that question clear?
I'll take the first question on climate justice and how far it has come. There are quite a number of people and different groups that use the words climate justice. So I'll speak for the foundation, Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice. We have principles of climate justice, which you can find on our website, mrfcj.org. We want the whole narrative about climate to become more people-centered. This is about people. It's necessary to follow the science and respect the science, but let's tell the story in terms of what's happening to people all over the world and their hopes and their fears about climate. And so we want to have a global dialogue on climate justice, and we're delighted that WRI, Jennifer and our colleagues, have joined with us. So we're going to have a dialogue which we hope will open up space for discussion, safe spaces to talk about equity, not just equity in mitigation, what we mean by common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, what we mean by those who have benefited from fossil fuel having to take their responsibilities more seriously. We also want to talk about equity in adaptation, equity in transfer of technologies, equity in financing. And we hope that this dialogue will inform the process, and that when we have the 5th assessment report at the end of 2014, we'll also have a global flagship report on climate justice. And we can be held to account then on what we've tried to do, but we will be working very hard at it, and we're very happy to have as many people as possible join us in it, because we're only going to facilitate what we hope will be a very open process.
So communication about climate change, it's a very, very big question because, of course, when you're trying to be as effective a communicator about climate change as possible, you have to think about who you're talking to, what context. et cetera, et cetera. And so it's hard to find a one-stop shop, I think, for all the types of climate change information you might be interested in. From a development perspective, we're right now working very hard at USAID to improve our materials to show how climate change is how we're integrating climate change work throughout all of the development work that we're doing. So please stay tuned, at least from our website, for more and more easy to digest information about what climate change means, how to combat it, et cetera, and what USAID is up to. I personally go to WRI's website a lot if you want some really good information about latest forecasts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, opportunities to reduce emissions, and it's just a very data-driven organization, as USAID is as well. But I think that I'm a little bit at a loss in terms of recommending a one-stop shop for climate change communication. But I would encourage you, if you look at our website and if you find information or if you see information that you wish there was more of, to reach out to us and we can try and connect you with some more specific information.
The other place I would just point to are organizations like 350.org or Oxfam, or I know there's some women's networks here who work on climate change, also for that side, because I think the grassroots piece is very specific to local circumstances. So they may have national kind of action kits that you could utilize.
Yeah, just on that last point that Jennifer was making, I wanted to actually recognize some people in the audience who are here. Natalie Eddy, who works for the Global Gender Climate Alliance, who's done some great work in helping to get Gender Day pulled together, would be a great resource on gender and climate for you. And then also WEDO, and there are a number of other organizations that are working on gender and climate that you should certainly look to reach out to.
Well, this has been a wonderful and active discussion. We really look forward to maybe doing this next year. It was terrific. I want to thank all the panelists, thank the U.S. Center. Ashley, thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge Isabel Gates, who is the head here at the U.S. Center, but had a wonderful idea. Thank you, Isabel, for letting us try to offer it here on your behalf and the behalf of the U.S. government. Thank you,
A final round of
Ambassador
applause for
Zaideh.
our panelists. Thank you. Fantastic. Well, thanks again for joining us. We hope that you'll come back to the U.S. Center. We have events all week long. At 6 p.m. this evening, we have agricultural risk management, partnering with the private sector, so you'll learn a little bit more about some on-the-ground efforts the U.S. is doing. And at 5:30 p.m., there will be a presentation on the NASA Hyperwall, so I'll hope you'll check that out on your way out. And we'll be raffling a book called Our Changing Planet, a volume of satellite images. So thanks again for coming, and we hope to see you again soon.